if you look at a lot of Western outlets now reporting on his death, they'll talk about things like joining the WTO and a lot of the things about opening China, quote unquote. But actually, domestically and internationally, he should best be remembered for starting the persecution of 100 million Chinese citizens, who at that time in 1999, the amount of Falun Gong practitioners was about 1 out of every 13 Chinese people.
Jiang came up the ranks after the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. 3 years later, experts believe he got spooked by one spiritual group's ability to attract tens of thousands of followers, including military officers.
And when the rise of Falun Gong happened from 92 to 99, it was the largest spiritual movement in Chinese history. So you have 0 to 100 million people, more people than were in the Chinese Communist Party. You know, it's really hard to explain to people that are in the West, but it was permeating every aspect of Chinese life. Imagine driving in any U.S. city, you look out in a park and you see people doing Qigong exercises. That was Falun Gong. People all around Jiang in the Politburo were practicing Falun Gong. So it was permeating everywhere. And it had these values of truthfulness, compassion, tolerance. And Jiang didn't believe in any of those values. Actually, he believed in corruption. He believed in, power and money. And so he famously would have the saying of like corruption and money kind of over everything. And so in 1999, he decided, by himself through jealousy and because he just felt like Falun Gong was this kind of existential spiritual threat in his mind, to start the persecution of Falun Gong. But when he did that, he had a famous quote, which was to defame their reputations, bankrupt them financially, and destroy them physically. So that was his plan for Falun Gong. And the way that he did that was he first started with the propaganda arm. So all the state-controlled media, at that time they're building the Great Firewall, so you have to turn the populace against Falun Gong. And they did that tried to do that in a variety of ways over the course of many years, which is very effective in a country that has total control over the media. And so that took some time. They started to do that. At the same time, to bankrupt them financially, people are losing jobs for practicing Falun Gong. Kids can't go to school. People are becoming homeless. And then to destroy them physically, there's massive, crackdowns and jailings. Very famously, when the persecution of Falun Gong started, they had to house them in stadiums when they were rounding people up because they didn't have enough room. And so what quickly became apparent is that for Jiang Zemin to persecute 1 out of every 13 Chinese people, and Falun Gong spread all across the country, right? It's not like Uyghurs where you're just mostly in Xinjiang. Falun Gong was in every province and every city. And so he needed to create an infrastructure of persecution for Falun Gong. And so he created the 610 office, which is an extra legal force. It's the Gestapo of China, which had reported directly to him outside the law, and a total blank check budget. And so what they did was they set up black jails, brainwashing centers, basically torture sites, even an infrastructure that we later learned was used for forced organ harvesting through the military hospitals. And so they spent an enormous amount of budget on this, and through the 610 office, Jiang Zemin persecuted millions of practitioners, potentially, many, many, many deaths recorded, 4,800 deaths from torture, but that number is not the real number. That's just the one we can prove. And so his legacy is one of, destroying tens and tens of millions of lives and creating countless deaths.
Falun Dafa was first introduced to the public as a form of Qigong, or spiritual meditation, called Falun Gong, in China in 1992. It was once promoted by Beijing and state media as part of a nationwide Qigong craze. Qigong is a kind of ancient Chinese exercise and healing technique.
They invited the teacher and founder, Mr. Li Hongzhi, to teach it in France at the embassy, for instance. They introduced it to the West. It was praised by the premier, Zhu Rongji. So there's a lot of promotion of Falun Gong in society, and they're getting a lot of benefits, health benefits, these moral benefits. And for once, it was something that was really Chinese. It was about kind of cultivation and these Taoist, Buddhist roots going back to that. And so the Chinese people, at that time, when it's spreading, can feel a lot of hope and ability to practice, like actually use the Chinese Constitution, freedom of belief.
According to Ben, that is until Jiang turned the whole state against them and started mass jailing and torturing the group. In 2002, a group of Falun Gong practitioners hijacked a local television broadcast in Changchun. Their goal? To air a video opposing Beijing's negative portrayal of the practice. Some of those involved ended up imprisoned, tortured, or killed.
When you're someone that witnesses that and you grow up with that in China, what is your understanding of your freedom of belief or your freedom of speech? You don't have freedom. You don't have freedom of, like, if you see that the government can turn on 100 million people that all believe in, truthfulness, compassion, tolerance, what are they going to do to you? What chance do you have?
Ben says the persecution against Falun Gong that Jiang initiated has had major effects on Chinese society.
The Falun Gong was the fastest growing spiritual movement in Asian history, going from 0 to 100 million in 7 years. And you think about that growth track, this is pre-internet, pre-virality, this is word of mouth, heart to heart. And so you have this whole changing of the fabric of Chinese society that's starting to believe in truthfulness, compassion, tolerance on a massive scale, right? 1 out of 13 people. This is obviously very different than Marx's theory of atheism, struggle, violence, right? So that's changing the fabric of Chinese society to lean more towards their true Chinese roots and things that are quite good, objectively quite good. And so when Jiang Zemin decides personally to start the persecution of Falun Gong, that really brings China back to the darkest ages, to Maoist days or Cultural Revolution days, where you're turning the terror and the violence against fellow citizens. And so when we talk about openness, we really should be talking about openness within China's ability for their citizens to exercise their constitutional rights of freedom of belief, Chinese constitutional rights of freedom of belief, or freedom of speech. And so, if you ask me, I think an interesting question would be, if Jiang had not started the persecution of Falun Gong, how many people will be practicing in 2009? If you look at the growth track, right, 0 to 100 million, 1 out of 13 in 7 years, what does the growth track look like in the next 10 years? Would 1 out of 5 people be practicing? So how would that change the fabric of Chinese society if they weren't caught up in this, kind of CCP trap of, fear and kind of struggle that they have the Chinese people in?
Ben says the effect has been traumatic and that similar tactics are now being used in China against Uyghurs, Tibetans, and Christians.
Are you going to feel comfortable to speak out? What power do you have to believe that you have any rights in Chinese society when you see that? And what lingering effect does that have on Chinese society as a whole? That's a lot of the goal of the persecution, right? Is to get an iron fist on Chinese society, is the corruption that Jiang started, and is just that to maintain power through violence.
Ben says the mechanisms Jiang set up to persecute Falun Gong practitioners are still in place, but following his death,
perhaps that gives an opportunity to people to not follow down the path that the mechanisms he created. But I would appeal more towards the Chinese people, right? Even right now today, estimates of 20 to 40 million practitioners in China running over 200,000 material sites, going door to door, street to street in the dead of night to deliver what is the truth. It's almost like an underground media network to tell people this is still going on, and what's really happening, because Chinese Communist Party. So I would appeal to those people, to the Chinese people, to have their conscience raised, rather than I would anything to the CCP.
Falun Gong practitioners still face persecution in China today. NTD News.